Baldur's Gate 3 completely took over the gaming world when it was released in 2023. I don't know that anyone could have really predicted how successful Baldur's Gate 3 would become. It even went on to win Game of the Year in what was possibly the most competitive year ever for gaming. You don't need me to tell you that this game is undeniably great. So this video isn't a traditional review. Instead, I want to focus on one question. Is Baldur's Gate 3 a good game for couples? Now, I'm not saying I'm an expert on relationships, but my wife and I do play video games together every night and have been for years. And I can go ahead and tell you that we found out that just because a game is great, it doesn't mean that it's a great game to play with your significant other. And after spending a month or two playing Baldur's Gate 3 in co-op, we've definitely got some thoughts on whether or not we think this is a game that most couples would enjoy playing together. So first, let's talk about what options you have for playing Baldur's Gate 3 with someone else. Thankfully, you've got lots of options no matter what your situation is like. The game is available on PC, PlayStation 5, and Xbox Series consoles. And one of the reasons you might be considering playing Baldur's Gate 3 together is because it offers local, split-screen multiplayer, which is pretty rare for games these days. So if you're able to be together, you can play the game together on the same screen. It's a great opportunity to reinforce that old lesson you learned in kindergarten: sharing is caring. The only exception is if you're trying to play on Xbox Series S. As far as I know, that version of the game does not allow for split-screen co-op, but the Series X does. The great thing is, if you're willing and able to put up with each other, you really only need one copy of the game, which is awesome. But the game can also be played in co-op via an online connection. This is great too, because if you're not able to be together for whatever reason, you can still play the game together as a couple. And actually, if you're playing online, up to 4 people can all play the game together. So if you're adventurous and you want to invite a third or fourth person to join you, you can do that. And if you play the game in co-op online, you each get to see a full screen version of the game, which is a really nice plus. The only downside is that in order to play online together, both of you need to own individual copies of the game, making it quite a bit more expensive to play this way. I should also point out that as of right now, the game is not able to be played in co-op online across different platforms. So although the game is available on PC, Xbox, and PlayStation, if you're going to play co-op via an online connection, you'll need to be on the same platform in order to play the game together. I do think there's plans to offer cross-platform play in the future, but I'm not sure when that will actually happen. So next, let's talk about what the co-op gameplay experience is actually like. Baldur's Gate 3 is a turn-based RPG, and a fairly in-depth one at that. The gameplay is actually based on the Dungeons & Dragons tabletop game, which, if you're not familiar, is basically a game where you pretend to be someone else and roll dice to see what happens. This game is absolutely filled with deep, complex gameplay mechanics, and unfortunately, the game doesn't do a whole lot to actually explain everything. There are tutorials, but they're fairly minimal. They basically just give you a brief explanation of what to do and then say, good luck. If you've played D&D, I think you'll probably have an easier time understanding everything, but if you haven't, you may struggle to grasp some of the game's mechanics. I know this from personal experience because my wife and I had never played anything even remotely associated with D&D, so there was quite a learning curve for both of us. And by learning curve, I mean a lot of trial and error and accidentally setting ourselves on fire. Luckily, we've been playing games together for years now, and we're both fairly patient, so we were up to the challenge of learning the game. That being said, if you're not a super experienced gamer, or if the person you're playing with hasn't played many games, Baldur's Gate 3 is more than likely going to feel pretty overwhelming, especially at first. The truth is, it may not be the best game for beginners, but all those mechanics lead to a very rich experience that you can get a lot out of if you're willing to stick it out. And you will have to stick it out because Baldur's Gate 3 is quite a long game. You can sink tons of hours into this one, like hundreds if you want to, especially when you consider the fact that many players end up replaying the game multiple times. You see, each playthrough can be quite different depending on your choices and actions, so in a way, it's a very good bang for your buck kind of game. If you're just looking to get your money's worth, Baldur's Gate 3 definitely delivers. The game just has so much variability and customization. You decide what type of character you play as, how you want to approach the combat, and which NPC you want to awkwardly try and romance right in front of your wife. There are so many options here. It's all really well thought out and high quality, but it's a lot. There's no getting around that. If you're a more casual gamer, it may end up feeling like it's all just a bit too much. In almost every way, playing Baldur's Gate 3 is a big commitment. And I'll just be honest, this isn't always the type of game that my wife and I are wanting to play together. Sometimes we prefer a more casual experience, but Baldur's Gate 3 just isn't a very casual game. What I mean is it's not a lean back kind of experience. This is definitely a lean forward kind of game that asks a lot from the player, but you know, it also gives a lot back in return. So is Baldur's Gate 3 a good game for couples? I think it really just depends on the couple. If you play a lot of games together and are very experienced, then yeah, I'd say absolutely yes, 100%. Baldur's Gate 3 is one of the best co-op experiences that you could possibly imagine. But if one of you or both of you are a little newer to gaming, there's a chance that Baldur's Gate 3 may not be the best game to play together, just because it can be a lot and its massive scope can be quite overwhelming. Now, it still may be worth playing, even for those who aren't as adept at gaming, but you just need to know that there will very likely be a big learning curve, and there may be some frustrations along the way. Finally, if you're a couple that's new to gaming or gaming together, I might advise against Baldur's Gate 3. It's really just not very beginner friendly, so unless you're just hell-bent on playing it, I would suggest trying some other co-op games that are more accessible to new players than this one. And you know, Baldur's Gate 3 isn't going anywhere, so you can always come back to it once you get your feet wet and you become a little more comfortable with gaming and the individual mechanics that make up a massive RPG like this one. In fact, if you're looking for a co-op RPG that's a lot more beginner friendly, I would suggest checking out our review of Cat Quest 2. It's a super accessible game, but it still has a lot of the classic mechanics you'd expect to see in an RPG, so if you're wanting to dip your toe into this genre, Cat Quest 2 might just be the perfect game for you. But honestly, it's also just a really fun co-op game, so even if you've been playing games together for quite a while, I might look into it. Or, you could just play Mario Kart. That's always a safe bet.